to the show. My name is Naeem Sharif, and today our topic is breaking white silence. And we have some special guests today. To my right is Mary Hosher, and to my far right is Paul Finley. Mary, would you just give us a brief background of yourself?
Yes, I grew up in Spokane and came to Seattle in 1966 to go to Seattle University, and I've been here ever since.
Okay.
And I am a recently retired psychologist.
Okay, all right. And Paul?
Well, I came to Seattle in '77, and did we say we're married? We should say that. I'm a mental health counselor working in private practice.
Okay, very good, very good. So you can do hopefully some surgical work on this breaking white silence then, hopefully. Okay. What made you all join the organization, and maybe kind of give why you joined and some background of who started the organization?
Okay, so Breaking White Silence is a project of Finney Neighborhood Association, which is based on Finney Ridge, North Seattle.
Okay.
It's an outgrowth of a series of conversations that started in 2015 called Difficult Conversations Race.
Okay.
And out of that, Cecily Kaplan, who's the director of the Senior Center at the PNA, and Karen Schneider, who's a longtime community activist, decided to organize a group around dealing with racism, and especially people with more progressive values looking at their own racism.
Okay.
And so she invited me, and so in some ways the whole group is it's a small affinity group that does the organizing, but the whole process is sort of one of invitation.
Okay.
I wanted to say a couple things just in terms of the story of how
Yeah,
it started,
go ahead.
because
we need to hear it.
In 2014, Karen was at a Black Lives Matter rally, and Reverend Harriet Walden came up and said to her, I appreciate you being an ally, but the best thing you can do is go back to your own community and talk to white people and change their hearts and minds.
Okay.
So Karen really took this as a call, and so right from the beginning, that's been our purpose. And the name comes, we chose our name at our very first organizing meeting, which was in November of 2016, a momentous month. And it's from Alicia Garza, co-founder of Black Lives Matter. This quote: "We need you defecting from white supremacy and changing the narrative of white supremacy by breaking white silence."
Okay.
So that's our sort of origin story.
Oh, that says a lot.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it? It really does.
And one other thing is that, so the vehicle we're using to break white silence is forming study groups, small study groups that are free and by invitation public, and sometimes in church groups or community groups, synagogues, to study a book by anti-racist educator Robin DiAngelo.
Okay.
And the book is called "What Does It Mean to Be White?"
Okay.
And it's originally more of an academic book, so we really felt like it needed people to really talk together to go into their own experience. And so Paul and I both participated. You were a participant, and I was a facilitator at the beginning of one of these study groups. So that's kind of the form we're using.
Okay. Okay. Paul, would you like to add to that?
Oh yeah, it's a pretty involved book, and it needs to be involved because I think the level of understanding, I mean, this notion of developing white racial literacy is such a high need, that meaning there's just so little understanding of racial dynamics among white people. So they just have to be there's a lot we have to get. And so it's kind of a textbook almost. And so we decided to take it really seriously. And so these groups are, you know, usually between 5 and 7 different meeting periods for almost 2 hours or so.
Okay.
And then there's, you know, quite a bit of reading in the middle. And so we try to really stay pretty close and pretty disciplined about the learning process, partly because one of the things we're trying to break is the attitude that white people know very much about race. And so we're trying to actually get a much more open attitude about what we know and what we especially don't know. And so a lot of it is just looking in at sort of white defensiveness and sort of the ways that white people stay ignorant about what's happening.
Yeah. And the way white people often think of racism as a problem people of color have, rather than a problem
that white
we
people
have.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
and one of the particularly, for me, very cool things about the work we're doing is our focus is on progressive white people primarily. So that we're, instead of looking at those racists, we're looking at the way we've been sort of saturated in white supremacy our whole lives, and how unconscious and insidious it is inside of us. So that's a lot of the power of the book sort of stirs up all the ideas, and then the conversations keep us focused on ourselves and our own sort of making the unconscious conscious, and then taking action to actually break white silence in situations where it's a good thing to do.
Gotcha. Paul, you were going to add something?
Oh, darn it. I just had it in the tip of my tongue.
I always get that. I understand you have it, and then that's where you see I'm writing notes.
Oh, I knew what I was going to say. It's great you were picking that up. My attitude about this, and it seems like Robin DiAngelo is saying the same thing, that if somehow the avowed racists in this country just poof disappeared, racism would trundle along pretty much undeterred. It would just go on. So that what we're really dealing with is we're not really addressing, it's sort of the obvious points. So those are easy points to make about people who are avowed racists. But what happens a lot of times with white people is they think that that's where the problem lies. And so this is why it's so important to address the way that white supremacy is woven into kind of white progressive culture, unless we can begin to understand what it is to be a white person and what this notion of being white is, almost as a property, and the idea that white people hide behind the quote neutrality of whiteness, as if that's the world, as if that's such an incredibly powerful way to dominate other people, is not to identify your own position.
Gotcha. Because we know that Seattle is considered a progressive city.
Right.
But I know several people of color feel, well, it's progressive for the Caucasians.
Right.
It's not necessarily that for
exactly.
People of color.
Right.
I mean, you look at you go down by where Amazon is and Google down in Seattle, and you see a certain people there, and you hardly you might see a few people of color, but you don't see them there, and I don't think their voices are being heard in technology. They're trying to do more STEM programs in the Seattle area, but there's just, you look at it and it's just like, well, all these people have these good jobs, but I don't see people of color having that. So they're progressing, but maybe not, other folks. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So you kind of mentioned on it. So what are the goals of the organization? What would you say the goals are?
Well, it's this idea of developing what Paul was saying about developing white racial literacy, which basically means white people understanding the structural nature of racism, and recognizing that it's our problem. But one of the things that's the challenging thing is it's moving really from being literate to being fluent, which means being able to talk about it, and that's the breaking white silence part. Like talk about in situations where there's some kind of racism being perpetuated or unconscious bias, or like you were saying, in the hiring situation,
Right.
Or in our neighborhood up in Finney Ridge, which is a predominantly white neighborhood, and people are prone to saying things, it's too bad we live in a more segregated city,
Right,
as if white people it just happened happened
just
that
sort of
way.
a passive.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's waking white people up to their own stuff, including ourselves. So we're not like any experts on this. We're
Right.
waking ourselves up in exactly the same way.
Yeah, just good volunteers.
Yeah, exactly.
Paul, what would you say, what folks seem to be interested in being part of this movement or project?
Oh, well, it's funny, the first thing that comes to my mind with that question is what folks are not. And sorry to say, I was like, geez. And what concerns me and us is that there are so few, since it's a project where white people are trying to educate among white people, partly so that black people don't have to have that responsibility. And also so they don't have to make themselves vulnerable, and they shouldn't have to. So now white people are trying to do this among ourselves. The low participation of men is really in evidence, and so we are realizing as we learn and as we figure this out that we have to do more explicit outreach to men. And I just filled another group that I'm going to be co-leading starting in January with a male facilitator, and we were partly trying to just show that men are partly doing this, but also we realized we had to make much more explicit invitations in our written material, but also I remember saying to somebody, would you pass this on to your husband?
Exactly.
And it turned out that he signed up, but I was like, I really had to make, and I'm really learning from Mary about just being much more, you got to push more to get men doing this. And I know that seems to correspond pretty well to, attitudes, racial attitudes, and it seems like some of the more problematic things that happen are among white men particularly. So I'm not exactly surprised, but it's really noticeable.
That is something. That is something. Mary, did you want to add something to that?
Well, I just want to say how we promote the groups we
Okay.
do is we have the private groups, people invite their friends and their communities. But the public group gets advertised through the Finney Neighborhood Association
Okay.
newsletter.
Okay.
So it's the kind of large group of people who are part of that and who read the newspaper, or read their newsletter.
Okay.
And that's where I think the invitation, more personal invitation is really important, especially to men, because they're not, I don't think they're as likely to be sitting reading through the course list.
Got you.
And they have the most to lose when it comes to white supremacy,
Yeah,
too.
that's
So
true.
there's I think the most resistance, and to some extent, what Robin DiAngelo calls the most white fragility, which is kind of a basically a very defensive reaction that serves to perpetuate racism.
Right.
And
That's
her
when
point
white
is it actually
supremacy.
serves to bully. It's a form of bullying. White fragility is can become a form of bullying.
Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit more? Your understanding of it.
Yeah.
Good.
Good. There's something about what happens when white people suddenly become the center of attention in their, quote, problem, in their hopelessness, in their tears. oh my God, I didn't realize, I didn't mean to hurt you. There's something about this kind of gigantic response that suddenly causes people of color to feel suddenly now they're sidelined again. And there's something that also says, it sort of claims the victim position, which I think happens a lot. In bullying situations, actually, it's a real interesting paradox. But it sort of says, I'm the one who's being harmed here. And that actually really is harmful. I think it's really harmful when people who have waited for centuries to be seen, and then they start to speak up, and then the people who have been doing the dominating start to make themselves the center of attention, and get all kind of, they get brittle, and they get defensive, and then they can start to attack, or they can start to, do this wavering stuff. It feels like that can actually, the effect is that it harms people. And I guess that's what I'm calling it bullying.
Just to add to that too, it's that I think there's some differences in how men and women express their fragility, because I think men are more likely to be argumentative and defensive in that particular kind of way. Right. But women are often just, I feel so guilty, I feel so bad. And there's a chapter in Robin's more recent book, White Fragility, that's called White Women's Tears, which is just sort of falling apart and basically being unable to withstand the discomfort. So one of the things that is a purpose of our project is to help people just develop more resilience and more capacity to tolerate discomfort in talking about race. Because most of us, we're not raised at all to experience any discomfort out in talking about race.
So equating comfort with safety is a problem. Like, saying, I don't feel safe. No, you don't feel comfortable. Get used to it.
Yeah.
Black people have been feeling comfortable for a long time when they're minoritized and shoved off to the side and not listened to. So the idea that I don't feel comfortable is not the same as I'm not safe. And then white people often make the claim, I'm not safe.
And then like this comes, we can see this a lot when it comes with people of color, especially African Americans, dealing with police.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Totally. We felt unsafe, so we had to shoot.
We had to shoot.
Actually, it's an unfortunate parallel. That is the dynamic. And if you happen to be a cop, it's deadly.
Because that's always the go-to to get
that's
them
right.
out, get
That's
them out
right.
of
That's right.
killing some people unjustifiably.
Right.
I felt threatened.
Like the latest shooting in the mall.
Yeah.
The one that just happened last week.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just like, well, there's been several with the young kid who was in the park.
Yeah.
And someone called, said he had a gun, and the cop shot him within 2 seconds.
2 seconds.
And he's a kid.
Yep.
Right.
And he's in an open carry state.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's that's it. But you were going to add something else.
I was thinking that this in our groups, instead of calling what we're doing creating safe space, we talk about it as creating brave space. So that we working to increase people's courage and capacity to take risks with the understanding they're safe. They're white people generally in this culture are safe.
Yes, right.
And that safe space idea comes out of dealing with people who have trauma. And in this, even if with women who may have had trauma in their own histories, our purpose is to focus on the part of their experience that isn't the trauma part. It's we're, especially with women, have to move from identifying with the victim to looking at ways they perpetuate racism. And that's a challenging thing.
Yeah.
Because one of her points is, Robin DiAngelo's points, is that all of us have had situations where we've been powerless, or we've been humiliated, or we have not had advantages. And so it's important for white people to understand that even though I've been traumatized, or even though I've been, the victim of sexism or classism or something like that, I haven't also had to deal with race. I have not had that. And so trying to learn how to step aside and just say, okay, in this area, I've had all this privilege, all these advantages that I didn't, the joke about being born on second base and thinking you hit a double.
Correct,
And that's important to get.
Yeah, interesting. Where do you see America going concerning race relations?
Wow.
I think you just answered it.
Well, I actually have very mixed feelings about it, because on the one hand, it's definitely on the one hand, on the other hand. On the one hand, there is a recognition of systemic racism that I think is people are beginning to get in the culture, and that's very good and important. And I do think there's something about everyone who has thought of racism as being out there looking at themselves. It is starting to happen in progressive communities, and I think that's a good thing. But then there's this increase in hate crimes and in vitriolic expressions of racism that is terrifying. And so I think of it as like kind of a major turning point, and we hope that all the people who are doing good work toward it going in the direction that's toward healing and solidarity of all people wins out. And I happen to feel hopeful about that.
That's good.
But not every day.
Yeah, that's true.
And in a way, you just mentioned something about feeling hopeful. I feel like hope is sort of a discipline, that it's important to feel hopeful. That hopelessness is another way that white people let themselves off the hook. They just go, well, it's a big problem. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't a slave holder. I mean, I don't know. I mean, and then you just go, well, it's too big. So in a way, I want to always lean into hope, because it's my duty in a way. It's like it's just an important thing to maintain that position. But I want to just also talk about that this period, right, where we have this hopeful side, and then we have this this more explicit kind of the leaking out of this vitriolic and violent white forms of white dominance. I take a little bit of a hopeful attitude towards that, because what's always been under the surface is just now becoming more obvious, more patently obvious. Obviously, these things have been going on forever. It's now this is not the first time it's been thought, but the point is that having cell phones and having the ability to videotape things has brought a lot of attention to, especially white people. Black people, this is no news, it seems to me, but it seems that white people are going, are you kidding, really? Is that how that went down? So that's good. But it also, I think what's scary is that it can also get white progressives doing this thing where they say, see, we're not doing that, we didn't do that, they're not, those are the bad cops. That sort of sense that they're not any part of it. And that's where I want to maintain, that's why we're doing this group, is to say, no, you are a part of it. And it's not a personal thing, it's not a personal badness, because that's a critical point that Robin DiAngelo makes, which is, one of the logics that keeps racism alive among white people is they say, a racist must be a bad person, and since I'm not a bad person, I am not a racist, and therefore I cannot be perpetuating this thing that harms black people or people of color. So that dynamic, you have to get out of that dynamic. You have to say, you're a white person, and it's not your personal failure. It's that you're part of a system, and the system has been set up to create value, essentially, to create property, and an advantage for white people, and it's been going on for centuries, and you're part of it. So we all have to be part of that and look at that.
And we all have to use our privilege.
Very good.
Use our privilege.
Exactly. So we got about maybe a minute or so before credits come on. Mary, any closing remarks?
I guess that's it, is that we have to, given that we have our privilege, we have to use it. We have to use it. We have to be discerning about when to use it and how to use it.
I think that's the best point, is to put ourselves out, to understand that we have to make good use of this position by challenging racism as a white person, especially directly addressing it towards other white people. Because
and institutions
yes,
as well.
And institutions.
Institutions.
Yeah,
Okay. We've covered some good ground. I think that this gives people a chance to see there are people who are trying to make a difference, because we normally just see the negative in society, and we don't see people who are trying to make a difference. And I must I commend you all, because that's a tough responsibility, to try to get people to understand and listen and to kind of think in a little bit kind of different thing. Only thing I would add would be, just like when the young people say, well, I want to be an activist, I want to get involved, and I know you guys know this, is that you got to be in it for the long run, because if you're in it for the short run, you'll get disappointed, discouraged, and you'll just give up and never mind. And especially the young people, I say, don't burn yourself out, especially because you look at things and it could be generations that have to move on and so forth. So we thank you all for coming on the program, and again, the topic was breaking white silence, and it's something that is not discussed that often, but we're glad to see that you're involved in a group that is doing that, and just keep up the work, and if there's any assistance that we can provide, we would love to do that. So we thank our audience, all of our technicians, all the help. We thank you all for coming out today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And you can see our program on cable TV and on YouTube. So thank you for watching, and peace.